The night the stranger collapsed at the gate, Eleanor Hartley had already been told, twice, that she did not matter. The first time was at breakfast, when her mother looked past her to admire the way morning light caught Cassandra's hair, and said nothing at all to Eleanor, as though she were a chair someone had forgotten to push in. The second time was an hour later, when her father folded the letter from Ravensmere Hall, cleared his throat, and announced to the drawing-room that the Duke himself was expected in the county before the month was out, and that Cassandra must be readied, gowned, polished, and presented like the last hope of a drowning family, because in every practical sense, she was. Eleanor had only nodded, and gone back to mending the hem of a dress that was not hers. For a dance she would not attend, in a house that had long ago stopped pretending she was anything but useful. She was 23, unmarried, and by her mother's estimation, unmarriageable. Too quiet, too plain beside her sister's brightness. Too fond of ledgers and kitchen gardens to be considered ornamental. Cassandra was the beauty the family had built its last hopes upon, and Eleanor was the girl who kept the house from collapsing, while everyone admired Cassandra for existing. She did not resent her sister. That was the strange private ache of it. She loved Cassandra, truly the way one loves a bright, careless thing that has never had to earn its place in the world. What Eleanor resented, quietly, in the hours after the candles were put out, was the particular exhaustion of being necessary and invisible at once. So when the storm came in off the moor that evening, howling low over the hedgerows and rattling the shutters like something trying to get in, Eleanor was the one who heard. Over the wind, a sound that was not the wind at all, a low human cry, near the old stone gate at the end of the drive. Her mother told her to ignore it. Vagrants and thieves haunted the roads in weather like this, she said, and no respectable household opened its door to strange men after dark. Not with the Duke's visit so close, and a household's reputation so fragile. Eleanor took a lantern and went anyway. She found him half buried in wet leaves at the foot of the gatepost, one arm bent beneath him, his greatcoat soaked through, and his face so pale in the lantern light that for one terrible moment she thought she had found a corpse. Then his eyes opened, and even through the pain in them, even through the confusion of a man who did not know where he was, there was something in that gaze, a kind of quiet, startled attention, that made her breath catch before she understood why. "Please," he said, in a voice roughened by cold. "My horse bolted. Don't speak," she told him, already working her cloak free and pressing it around his shoulders. "Save your strength. You're not far from shelter now." He looked at her as though shelter were the last thing he expected from the world that night, and something in that look would stay with her long after she understood exactly who he was. She could not carry him alone, and so she ran back to the house, breathless, and demanded help from the stable boy, ignoring her mother's protests from the doorway that they knew nothing of this man, that he might be a criminal, that Cassandra's reputation could not survive scandal so near the Duke's arrival. Eleanor did not stop to argue. She simply said that a man was dying at their gate, and that she would not have his death on her conscience for the sake of anyone's reputation. And something in her voice, quiet, but immovable, silenced even her mother. They brought him into the old stone outbuilding that had once been a dairy and was now used for storing apples, because her mother would not permit a stranger under the family roof, whatever his condition. Eleanor lit a fire in the small hearth there herself, boiled water, found what dry linens she could, and when she realized there was no blanket left to spare, the household stores had grown as thin as everything else about the Hartleys, she did not hesitate. She went to her own room, took the single wool blanket from her narrow bed, the only one she owned that had not already been given to Cassandra's trousseau chest, and carried it back through the rain to wrap around a stranger whose name she did not yet know. It was, she would later think, such a small thing, a blanket, a kindness anyone might have offered. She had no way of knowing that the man shivering beneath it was Alaric Vane, Duke of Ravensmere, and that the entire county was already searching the storm-lashed roads for him. She had never in her life had cause to imagine a duke shivering on the cold flagstones of her family's dairy house. And if she had been told, in that moment, exactly who lay beneath her blanket, she would not have believed it, not because dukes seemed impossible creatures to her, but because the man before her seemed, in every way that mattered, entirely ordinary. He gasped in pain the way any man might. He gripped her hand with the same desperate, unguarded fear as any frightened traveler far from home. There was nothing in him, in that raw and unprotected hour, to suggest he had ever commanded a single soul in his life, let alone an estate that spanned 3 counties and a fortune that could have purchased her family's entire holding a dozen times over. That, though she could not have known it yet, was precisely the point. A title could be put on and taken off like a coat. What remained beneath it, in the hour a man believed no one of consequence was watching, was the only truth Eleanor had ever cared to notice in anyone. Her mother's protests had followed her the entire distance back to the stone dairy house, growing shriller with every step, but Eleanor had long ago learned the particular art of hearing her mother without truly listening, and she used it now, gratefully, as she worked. Behind her, she was dimly aware of her father hovering in the doorway of the main house, wringing his hands in the ineffectual way he handled every crisis that could not be solved with a book or a quiet walk through his orchard, offering no help and no hindrance either, which was, in its own resigned way, exactly what she had come to expect of him. It fell to her, as it always did, to manage the practical business of survival, while the rest of her family managed their opinions about it. He had been thrown from his horse 3 miles from the Hartley gate, in the wild dark where the road bent low along the river, and had walked, or crawled, in the last stretch, toward the only light he could see. He had left Ravensmere Hall that afternoon in plain travelling clothes, and without his retinue for reasons he barely admitted even to himself. He was tired, bone-deep tired, of a world that only ever showed him its best face, because it wanted something from him. For 6 years he had worn the title like armor. Every smile turned toward him carried calculation somewhere beneath it. Every young woman presented for his consideration had been coached, polished, arranged like a piece for sale. He had grown so accustomed to flattery that he no longer trusted warmth when he saw it, and so, when word reached him that a new season of hopeful families was already assembling itself around his impending visit to the county, something in him had simply wanted, for one evening, to disappear. He had not intended to nearly die in a ditch for the privilege, but when he opened his eyes in that small stone dairy and saw a young woman kneeling before the fire, feeding it carefully so it would not smoke, her hair coming loose from its pins, her hands reddened with cold and work, tending to him with the brisk, unglamorous competence of someone who had done difficult things all her life without expecting thanks for them, he felt something in his chest loosen that had been clenched for longer than he could remember. "You needn't trouble yourself so," he managed, when she pressed a cup of warmed broth into his hands. "I am a stranger to you. You don't know what I am. You are cold," Eleanor said simply, "and hurt, and it is raining. I don't need to know anything else tonight." He almost told her the truth then. The words rose in his throat, an instinct, sudden and strange, to be known by someone who had not yet learned to perform kindness for his benefit. But exhaustion pulled him under before he could speak, and when he woke again it was morning, and the decision had somehow already been made for him. He would not tell her who he was. Not yet. He gave his name as Alaric Vane, true enough, if incomplete, and let her family believe what her mother had already decided to believe, that he was a groom or minor land agent, thrown from a hired horse, of no consequence to a household with grander matches to secure. Mrs. Hartley, informed that the stranger had survived the night, declared with visible relief that he could recover in the dairy house and be sent on his way the moment he was fit to travel, and that under no circumstances was he to be permitted near the house proper, where Cassandra's reputation required careful guarding before the Duke's arrival. It did not occur to her, it occurred to no one, that the Duke had already arrived and was resting 40 yards from her drawing-room window, listening to her daughter practice scales on a piano with the patient contempt of a woman certain her family's fortunes were about to change. For 3 days, Eleanor was the only one who came to him. She came with broth, with clean linens, with quiet reports of the weather and the harvest, and though her mother scolded her for wasting hours on a man of no consequence, Eleanor found she did not particularly care. There was something restful in his company that she had not expected. He asked questions, and seemed to actually listen to her answers, which was more than she could say for most of the drawing rooms she had ever sat in. "You run this household," he said, on the second evening, watching her mend a torn coat sleeve by firelight, with the quick, unconscious skill of long practice. "Not your mother, not your sister." "You, someone must," Eleanor said, without self-pity. "My father is a dreamer, and my mother is occupied with securing my sister's future. Someone has to see that the roof does not leak, and the accounts do not run past what we can pay. And what of your future?" The question startled her enough that her needle paused. No one had asked her that in longer than she could remember. "I haven't the luxury of one," she said finally, with a small wry smile that he found more affecting than any of the practiced smiles he'd been offered by 100 hopeful debutantes. "I am plain, and poor, and 23, Mr. Vane. My future is this house, and whatever husband my mother eventually settles for me out of necessity rather than affection. I made my peace with it some time ago." He wanted, in that moment, to tell her that she was not plain at all, that there was something in her steadiness, her dry humor, her utter refusal to perform for anyone's approval, that struck him as rarer and more valuable than any beauty he had been paraded past in a London ballroom. He wanted to tell her a great many things. Instead he said only, "I think you underestimate yourself considerably," and watched a faint color rise in her cheeks that she quickly, deliberately, willed away. It was the first of many near confessions that would pass between them in the days that followed, moments where the truth of who he was and the truth of what he was beginning to feel both rose dangerously close to the surface and were both, for different reasons, pushed back down. On the second morning, when the fever had finally broken, and he was well enough to sit propped against the wall of the dairy house rather than lying flat upon the makeshift cot, she brought him bread and a small dish of preserves, apologizing for the plainness of it, explaining without self-pity that the household kept little in reserve this time of year. "I have eaten a great many meals prepared by the finest cooks in England," he told her, "and I do not think I have ever tasted anything as honest as this. You needn't flatter me, Mr. Vane. I know precisely what stale bread and last autumn's preserves taste like." "I am not flattering you," he said, and something in his tone made her look up from the fire. "I have grown so accustomed to food prepared to impress rather than to nourish that I had nearly forgotten what a simple meal, given without calculation, actually tastes like. I find I prefer it considerably." She did not know what to make of a man who spoke so plainly about things she had never thought to consider worth remarking upon. And so she said nothing, only watched him eat with an attentiveness she told herself was merely the natural vigilance of a nurse toward her patient, and not the quiet, dangerous pleasure of watching someone enjoy something she had made with her own hands. It became, over those 3 days, a kind of ritual between them, small hours stolen in the gaps between her household duties, conversations that ranged from the state of the harvest to the books she had read by candlelight long after her family had gone to sleep, to the private griefs neither of them had intended to share and found, somehow, impossible to keep to themselves once begun. He told her, without naming names or places, of a father who had died when he was too young to properly grieve him, and of the years afterward spent being taught, relentlessly, that affection was a currency to be spent carefully, never given freely, lest it be exploited by those who wanted only what his position could provide. He told her of a betrothal, years earlier, to a woman who had wept prettily at his sickbed during an illness that nearly killed him, and whom he had later discovered, through the careless gossip of her own maid, had spent those same hours calculating precisely how soon she might become a widowed duchess. "I have not trusted affection since," he admitted, staring into the low fire rather than at her. "I have come to expect that anyone who is kind to me wants something in return, even when they themselves do not fully realize it." "And do you believe that of me?" Eleanor asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "That is rather the trouble, Miss Hartley. I do not believe it of you at all, and I find I do not know what to do with that." She thought of that conversation often in the days that followed, turning it over the way she turned over every rare, unguarded thing anyone had ever offered her, uncertain whether to trust it or brace herself against the inevitable disappointment of discovering it had not been entirely true. He should have told her. He knew that even then. But some part of him, the part that had spent 6 years being loved for his title rather than himself, wanted, greedily, selfishly, to know a little longer what it felt like to be cared for, simply because a woman thought him worth caring for, and nothing more. It was Cassandra who first noticed something was strange about the stranger in the dairy house. She came upon Eleanor changing his dressing one afternoon, and lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, studying him with the assessing eye she had learned from their mother. "He doesn't speak like a groom," she said afterward, walking back toward the house beside her sister. "He doesn't hold himself like one either. Have you noticed his hands, Eleanor? No calluses. And his boots, beneath the mud, those are no labourer's boots." Eleanor had noticed. She had noticed a great many small contradictory things: the fine weave of the shirt beneath his ruined coat, the signet ring he wore turned inward on his hand as though trying to hide it, the unconscious authority in the way he spoke even while flat on his back with a fever. She had told herself it meant nothing. A man could fall on hard times. A man could have inherited fine things and lost his fortune since. But that evening, as she carried a fresh candle out to the dairy house, she overheard 2 of the stable hands muttering by the fence, and what she heard turned her blood cold. "They say half the county's out searching for him," one said. Duke of Ravensmere himself, thrown from his horse in the storm, vanished 3 nights now. His man come through the village asking after a gentleman travelling plain. Might have taken shelter somewhere along the river road. Eleanor stood very still in the dark, the candle trembling faintly in her hand, and felt the careful, ordinary world she had built over the past 3 days come apart at the seams. She did not go to him that night. She could not. She sat instead at her window long after the household had gone to sleep, turning over every conversation, every glance, every small, foolish hope she had allowed herself to feel for a man she now understood had lied to her, or, if not lied outright, had let her believe a smaller, safer version of the truth, because the real one was too enormous, too impossible, to hand to a girl like her. She thought of every unguarded word she had spoken to him, every complaint about her mother's favoritism, every quiet confession about her own resigned, unremarkable future. She had spoken to him as an equal, as no one of consequence, because she had believed herself safe in his unimportance. And he was a duke. The humiliation of it burned hotter than any anger. She had been foolish enough to feel something warm and unguarded toward a man who could have anything, anyone, in the whole of England, and he had let her believe, for 3 days, that she was speaking to nobody at all. When she finally went to him the next morning, her face carefully composed, she found him sitting up. Stronger now, colour returned to his face, and something in his expression shifted the moment he saw hers. "You know," he said quietly. "It was not a question." "I know," she confirmed, setting down the tray with more precision than was strictly necessary. "Your Grace." The title landed between them like something breaking. "Eleanor, you needn't explain yourself to me," she said, though her voice was not quite steady. "I understand perfectly well. A man of your position cannot simply announce himself in every ditch he happens to fall into. I was a convenience. A nurse. I imagine you've had a good deal of amusement observing how a poor family scrapes and schemes for your attention, not knowing you were laughing at us from our own dairy house the entire time." "I was not laughing," he said, and there was an edge of real feeling in it that made her pause despite herself. "Eleanor, I swear to you, I have not laughed once since I came to this house. I have felt—" He stopped, frustrated, searching for words that had never come easily to him where it mattered most. "I have felt more myself in 3 days speaking with you than I have in 6 years of being a duke. I did not tell you because I did not want it to change anything between us, because the moment you know what I am, everyone treats me as a title instead of a man. And I have had quite enough of that to last several lifetimes." Something in his voice, raw and unrehearsed, made her want to believe him. But belief was a dangerous thing for a woman like her to indulge, and she had learned long ago the cost of hoping for things that were not meant for girls like Eleanor Hartley. "It does not matter what you wanted," she said finally, quietly. "It matters what is true. And what is true, Your Grace, is that in 3 days you will be received in this county as the Duke of Ravensmere, and my sister will be presented to you in her finest gown, and I will be standing somewhere at the edge of the room in a dress that was made over from an old one, exactly where I belong. Nothing that passed between us here changes that." She left before he could answer, and if her hands trembled as she crossed the yard back to the house, she told herself it was only the cold. That same evening, as though fate had determined to test her resolve as thoroughly as possible in the space of a single day, her mother summoned her to the drawing-room with an announcement delivered in the bright, brittle tone she reserved for news she expected resistance to. "Mr. Edmund Cole has written to your father," her mother said, folding her hands with visible satisfaction. "He has expressed a serious interest in you, Eleanor, and given the state of our finances, I hardly think we are in a position to be particular. He is not young, I grant you, and his manner leaves something to be desired. But he is comfortably settled, and he does not require a beauty for a wife, merely a sensible woman to manage his household. You are, if nothing else, sensible." Eleanor had met Mr. Cole exactly twice, both times at parish gatherings, and both times had come away with the distinct impression of a man who viewed a wife much as he viewed a good milking cow, a practical acquisition, to be valued for its usefulness, and expected to require very little beyond feed and shelter in return. The thought of spending the rest of her life managing his household with the same quiet, unthanked competence she had spent managing her mother's had settled over her that night like a stone in her chest. "I have not agreed to anything," Eleanor said carefully. "There is very little to agree to," her mother replied. "Your father's debts will not settle themselves, and Cassandra's presentation to the Duke has cost more than I care to calculate. One daughter married to comfort, even without affection, eases a great deal of strain on this family. I should think you, of all people, would understand the necessity of it." It was, Eleanor reflected later, a particularly cruel irony that the very qualities her family relied upon her for, her practicality, her willingness to sacrifice her own comfort for the household's survival, were now being turned against her to secure a marriage she did not want, to a man she did not respect, at the precise moment she had, for the first time in her adult life, allowed herself to feel something for a man who saw her as more than merely useful. She said nothing to Alaric of Mr. Cole's letter. It seemed, somehow, too raw a thing to speak aloud to a duke, who would soon return to a world of glittering balls and eligible young women groomed from birth for exactly the kind of match he required, while she remained bound to whatever practical arrangement her family's circumstances demanded of her. What right had she to burden him with a fear that had nothing to do with him at all, and everything to do with the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of a struggling family's survival? He was gone the next morning. Not far. His own man had finally traced him to the Hartley estate, and arrived with a carriage and a change of clothes befitting his rank, and Alaric had no choice but to return to Ravensmere Hall to receive the physician, calm the alarmed households of 2 counties, and resume the enormous glittering machinery of being a duke. He left a note for Eleanor, brief and formal on the surface, but she read it perhaps a dozen times before she made herself stop. I did not lie to earn your kindness. I lied because your kindness, once given so freely to a man you believed had nothing to offer you, was the truest thing anyone has shown me in a very long time. I intend to prove that what I felt in your care was not gratitude alone. I ask only that you not close your heart against me before I have the chance to show you I mean it. A.V. She did not know what to do with hope like that. She had spent her whole adult life training herself out of it, precisely because hope, unmet, hurt more than resignation ever could. And so when her mother burst into the breakfast room 3 days later, breathless with the news that the Duke of Ravensmere had formally announced his ball at Ravensmere Hall, and that every eligible family in the county, including, God be thanked, the Hartleys, had been sent an invitation, Eleanor felt something close to dread rather than excitement. Her mother, of course, had already decided precisely how the evening would unfold. Cassandra would wear the blue silk, the one that had cost more than the household could truly spare. Cassandra would be presented first, positioned nearest the Duke's receiving line, coached in exactly the right words to say, and precisely how long to hold his gaze before demurely looking away. Eleanor would attend. Naturally, appearances required a full family showing. But her mother made it clear, without ever quite saying so, that Eleanor's role was to fade politely into the wallpaper and not, under any circumstances, embarrass the family by drawing attention that belonged to her sister. You might wear the grey, her mother said, examining Eleanor with the brisk, dismissive efficiency she reserved for matters of no real importance. It suits you. Unremarkable, no one will look twice, which is exactly as it should be, given the circumstances. Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing really to say. She had agreed with her mother's assessment of her own prospects for so many years that it no longer had the power to wound freshly. It simply confirmed what she already believed to be true. And yet, beneath the old familiar resignation, something new and unwelcome had lodged itself in her chest. The memory of a man who had looked at her, really looked at her, as though she were the most interesting person in any room she occupied. She hated how much she wanted, foolishly, desperately, for that to have been real. The days before the ball crept by in a fever of preparation that touched every corner of the house except Eleanor's own wardrobe. She oversaw the mending of gowns that were not hers, the polishing of jewelry that would adorn a sister she loved and envied in equal, exhausting measure, the careful rationing of a household budget stretched thin by the demands of a single glorious evening upon which the family's entire future seemed to hinge. It was Cassandra, unexpectedly, who came to her the night before the ball, sitting on the edge of Eleanor's narrow bed with an unusually solemn expression. "You gave him your blanket," Cassandra said quietly. "The stranger in the dairy house. Mother told me you'd stripped your own bed for a man we knew nothing about. It seemed the right thing to do at the time. It was the right thing to do," Cassandra said, surprising her. "I would not have done it, Eleanor. I would have found a dozen reasons why it wasn't my responsibility, and I would have slept soundly that night while a man froze at our gate. You've always been the good one. I don't think Mother ever forgave you for it. Somehow, for making the rest of us look smaller by comparison. Eleanor did not know what to say to that. It was, perhaps, the kindest and most honest thing her sister had ever said to her, and it arrived at precisely the moment she least expected tenderness from that quarter. "You'll be beautiful tomorrow," Eleanor said finally, because it was true, and because she did not trust herself to say anything closer to what she actually felt. "I don't want to be beautiful tomorrow," Cassandra said, with sudden, uncharacteristic frankness. "I want, for once, not to be the only thing anyone notices about me." "Do you know what it is, Eleanor, to walk into every room already knowing precisely what everyone will say of you before you've spoken a single word? I have never once been asked what I think of a book, or a piece of music, or the state of the world, only ever how I look while thinking of nothing at all." She twisted a loose thread on the counterpane, not quite meeting her sister's eyes. "I used to envy you your invisibility, you know. It seemed at times a kind of freedom I did not have." Eleanor had never once considered that her sister might envy her anything, and the admission settled strangely in her chest. Not quite comfort, but a fragile, unexpected kinship. The recognition that they had each, in their own way, been made to carry a burden the other could not fully see. "I know," Cassandra said, without vanity, only weariness. "I have always been beautiful, Eleanor. It has never once made me feel loved for who I am, rather than what I look like. Sometimes I wonder if that isn't a harder thing to carry than being overlooked." She rose, smoothing her skirts, and paused at the door. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I hope, for once, someone sees you properly. You deserve it more than any of us." Eleanor lay awake long after her sister had gone, turning those unexpected words over like a small, strange gift, and did not allow herself to hope for anything more than that. She thought, too, of the letter still folded in the drawer of her writing desk, its ink slightly smudged where she had read it too many times, with hands not quite steady. "I intend to prove that what I felt in your care was not gratitude alone," he had written, and she had spent a full week trying to decide whether those words were a promise or merely a kindness, the sort of thing a man of his position might say to soften a parting he did not truly intend to revisit. She was accustomed to disappointment arriving quietly, without drama, simply by nothing further happening at all. She braced herself, as the night of the ball drew nearer, for exactly that kind of silence, the gentle, unremarked forgetting that so often followed grand gestures once ordinary life reasserted itself. It was easier, she had found over the years, to expect the smaller sorrow than to risk the larger one. The ballroom at Ravensmere Hall was everything the county had whispered it would be. Chandeliers blazing gold light down onto polished floors, banks of hothouse flowers scenting the air, a small orchestra tuning in the gallery above, and a receiving line so long it stretched from the great doors nearly to the base of the staircase. Eleanor stood near the edge of it all in her grey dress, watching Cassandra glow in blue silk at the center of every conversation, and felt, not for the first time in her life, entirely invisible. She did not see him at first. The crush of guests, the noise, the dazzling unfamiliarity of the house itself, all conspired to keep her attention scattered until the moment the receiving line finally reached her family, and the Duke of Ravensmere turned to greet the Hartleys of Ashcombe. She knew him instantly, of course. She had known his face for 3 days by firelight, memorized it without meaning to, but seeing him now, in formal black, his bearing entirely transformed by the authority of his position, the deference of every person around him, was like meeting a stranger wearing a beloved face. Her mother sank into a deep, practiced curtsy, already steering Cassandra forward with barely concealed eagerness. "Your Grace, may I present my elder daughter Cassandra? We have met," the Duke said, and something in his voice made the entire receiving line go quiet. He was not looking at Cassandra. He stepped past her, past Eleanor's startled, mortified mother, and came to stand before Eleanor herself, and the whole glittering room seemed to hold its breath around them. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice, though perfectly correct, carried a warmth that made her chest ache. "I owe you a debt I have not yet found adequate words to repay." "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom now fixed upon them, of her mother's frozen, disbelieving expression, of Cassandra's confusion rippling into something sharper. "I did only what anyone would have done." "No," he said quietly enough that it felt almost private, though every word carried across the sudden hush of the room. "You did what almost no one does. You saw a man with nothing to offer you, no name, no fortune, no favor to return, freezing and afraid, and you gave him the only blanket you owned without a single thought of what it might cost you. I have been offered everything by everyone in this county over the past 6 years, Miss Hartley, and you are the only person who has ever given me something without wanting anything in return." A murmur swept through the ballroom, curiosity and scandal intertwining in equal measure. Her mother's face had gone through several distinct shades of horror and dawning, desperate recalculation. Cassandra simply stared, and to her credit, there was no jealousy in her expression, only a kind of stunned, sisterly wonder. "I don't understand," Eleanor said softly, though a treacherous, terrified hope was already unfurling in her chest. "Then let me be plain, before the whole of this county, so there can be no misunderstanding it afterward," the Duke said, and he took her hand, bare. Work roughened, entirely unlike the gloved hands of every other woman in that room, and held it as though it were the finest thing he had ever touched. "I did not fall in love with a duchess in waiting, groomed and presented for my approval. I fell in love with a woman who did not know who I was, who owed me nothing, and who chose kindness anyway, at cost to herself, when it would have been so much easier not to. I have spent 6 years surrounded by people who wanted my title. I would like, very much, to spend the rest of my life with the one woman who wanted nothing from me at all." The room had gone entirely silent now, but Eleanor barely heard the murmur that followed his words, because her attention had narrowed entirely to the man before her, to the unmistakable sincerity in his face, to the impossible, overwhelming reality of being chosen, truly, publicly, unmistakably chosen, for the very qualities she had spent her whole life believing made her invisible. It was, predictably, her mother who recovered first, already attempting to insert herself into the moment with the desperate agility of a woman watching an entire fortune slip away and scrambling to redirect it. "Your Grace is too kind to my daughter. She is, of course, delighted to receive such attention. We are honored beyond words. And might I say Cassandra has always spoken so highly, Mother." Cassandra said, quietly but firmly, in a voice Eleanor had rarely heard her use, "Please, let her have this." It was such a small sentence, and yet it did more to restore Eleanor's composure than anything else in that overwhelming evening. The sight of her sister, the beautiful favored one, stepping back deliberately to let the light fall somewhere it had never been permitted to fall before. But the evening was not without its cruelty. Word spread through the ballroom with the speed such things always did, and not every version of the story that circulated was kind. By the time the dancing resumed, Eleanor had already overheard, from behind a bank of orchids, 2 matrons of the county whispering that the Hartley girl must have engineered the entire episode, feigned a chance encounter, contrived to nurse him back to health precisely to entrap a duke, calculating and shameless beneath her plain grey dress. The words struck harder than she expected, precisely because they threatened to poison the one thing in her life she had never had to calculate for. She had given her blanket to a dying stranger, with no thought of gain. To hear it recast now as scheming ambition felt like a small, particular theft. She was still standing rigid with the sting of it when the Duke found her again, having noticed, with the sharp attentiveness that had first drawn her to him, that something had changed in her bearing. "Someone has been unkind to you," he said, not quite a question. "It is nothing, Your Grace. It is not nothing, if it has taken the color from your face." When she did not answer, he turned, and to her utter astonishment, addressed the ballroom directly, his voice pitched to carry, without raising into anger. "I understand there is speculation this evening regarding how Miss Hartley came to my attention. Allow me to end it plainly. I arrived at her family's gate in a storm, in the plain clothes of a common traveller, having told no one my destination, and carrying nothing that marked my rank. Miss Hartley did not know who I was. She could not have contrived anything, because there was nothing to contrive, only a freezing stranger and a young woman who chose not to leave him to die of exposure, while her family debated the risk to their reputation. If anyone in this room wishes to question her character after that, they may direct the question to me." The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality than the shocked hush before. This one carried the particular discomfort of a room realizing it had been unkind and caught in the act of it. Eleanor felt tears rise, unbidden, not from sorrow now but from something far more overwhelming. The strange, unfamiliar sensation of being defended, publicly and completely, by someone who had nothing to gain from doing so. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly, once the orchestra had resumed and the room's attention had scattered back into its usual currents. "I did," he said. "I have watched people flatter and diminish you in the same breath for 3 days without you so much as flinching, Eleanor, because you had long ago decided you must simply endure it. I find I cannot do the same. I would like, if you will permit it, to spend a great deal more of my life making certain no one diminishes you again." There was of course more difficulty still to come before the evening's end. A distant cousin of the Duke's, a calculating woman named Lady Presswick, who had long hoped to secure the match for her own niece, attempted one final effort to discredit Eleanor by suggesting, loudly enough to be overheard, that a girl of such modest fortune could scarcely be expected to manage the demands of a duchess's position. That sentiment was a poor substitute for breeding and training, neither of which Eleanor possessed. It was Eleanor herself, this time, who answered, and something in her own steadiness surprised even her. "You are quite right that I have not been trained to manage a great house from birth, Lady Presswick," she said, with a composure that had been forged over years of holding her own household together with too little money and too much responsibility. "I have instead spent a decade learning to manage accounts that did not balance, servants who went unpaid, and a family whose comfort I secured before my own, without complaint, because it needed doing. I do not know if that qualifies me for a duchess's drawing room, but I suspect it has taught me a good deal more about care and responsibility than any dancing master ever could." Something shifted in the Duke's expression as she spoke. Not surprise, precisely, but a kind of deepened certainty, as though he had simply been waiting to see her defend herself to know, fully and finally, that his instincts about her had been correct from the very first night. Lady Presswick, finding no fertile ground for her cruelty, retreated with as much dignity as she could muster, and the matter, for all practical purposes, was settled. There remained, however, one final and more personal obstacle, and he arrived in the shape of Mr. Edmund Cole, red-faced with wine and wounded pride, who cornered Eleanor's father near the punch table with the aggrieved air of a man who believed himself cheated of a bargain already struck. "I was given to understand an arrangement was all but settled," Cole said, loudly enough that several heads turned. "It is a poor showing, sir, to encourage a man's suit and then permit your daughter to entangle herself with a duke the moment one appears. I do not care for being made a fool of." Mr. Hartley, who had spent the whole of his life avoiding confrontation wherever possible, seemed to shrink several inches under the weight of the accusation, and it was Eleanor herself, crossing the room before her father could stammer through an apology on her behalf, who answered, "No arrangement was ever settled, Mr. Cole," she said, with a calm that surprised even her. A letter was sent, and no reply was given, because I gave none. I am sorry if you believed otherwise, but I will not apologize for declining an offer I never accepted in the first place. Cole's mouth worked for a moment, caught between outrage and the sudden, uncomfortable awareness of just how many titled guests were now watching the exchange with open interest. He retreated, muttering something about ingratitude and the folly of women grown too proud for their circumstances, and Eleanor felt, watching him go, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settling relief. The particular relief of having spoken a hard truth aloud, rather than swallowing it, as she had swallowed so many hard truths before, for the sake of her family's convenience. Alaric, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a few steps away, came to her side once Cole had gone. I take it that was the comfortable arrangement your mother mentioned to me rather too eagerly earlier this evening. You needn't concern yourself with Mr. Cole, Eleanor said, though the faint, unexpected warmth of being defended, even silently, by his presence beside her was not lost on her. I do not concern myself with him in the least, Alaric said. I concern myself with the fact that you very nearly faced a lifetime with a man who thinks of a wife as he thinks of livestock, rather than say a single word of it to me, because you did not believe you had the right to burden a duke with the ordinary desperation of your circumstances. That is the last time, Eleanor, that you will ever need to carry something like that alone. It was in the quieter hours of the evening, after the crush of guests had thinned and the orchestra had slowed into something gentler, that the Duke led Eleanor out onto the terrace, overlooking the moonlit gardens, away from the noise and speculation of the ballroom. I owe you an apology as much as gratitude, he said, once they were alone, the cold night air a strange, welcome echo of the storm that had first brought them together. I let you believe a smaller truth for longer than I should have. I told myself it was to protect what was growing between us from the distortions my title always brings. But I think, if I am honest, I was also afraid that once you knew what I was, you would begin to perform for me the way everyone else does, and I would lose the one person who had ever simply seen me. I very nearly did resent you for it, Eleanor admitted, for letting me speak so freely, believing myself safe in your unimportance, when you were never unimportant at all. And now? She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. Now I think I understand what it cost you, to want to be known plainly, without the weight of your name attached. I think perhaps I have wanted the same thing myself, in a smaller way, my whole life, to be seen for something other than what I am useful for. Then we are perhaps better suited than either of us realized, he said, and there was such quiet hope in it that she felt something in her chest, guarded for years against exactly this kind of vulnerability, finally begin to loosen. Your family will not easily forgive being overshadowed, he added, with the ghost of a wry smile. Nor will half the county, I imagine, once the shock wears off and the calculating begins in earnest. I have spent my whole life being overlooked by people calculating their own advantage, Eleanor said. I find I no longer have much patience for caring what they think. There is one thing more I ought to confess, he said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply, bracing herself. Out of old habit, for a disappointment she had learned to expect just when happiness seemed nearest. I did not simply happen upon your gate by chance that night, Eleanor, not entirely. I had grown so weary of the season's calculated introductions that I had already resolved, before the storm ever caught me, to travel the county incognito for a time, to see, with my own eyes and without the distortion of my title, what sort of families truly lived within it, and how they conducted themselves when they believed no one of consequence was watching. I did not choose your gate on purpose, but I confess that once I understood what I had found there, I was in no great hurry to leave it. Then I was, in a manner of speaking, an experiment, Eleanor said, though there was more wry humor in it than hurt. "You were a revelation," he corrected gently. "There is a difference. An experiment is conducted to confirm what one already suspects. You confirmed nothing I expected. I arrived prepared to find greed dressed up as hospitality, or indifference dressed up as duty. Instead, I found a woman who gave away the last comfort she owned to a stranger who could offer her nothing, and then defended that choice to her own mother without once seeking praise for it. I did not plan to fall in love with you, Eleanor. I only know that by the second night, I could no longer imagine explaining to anyone else why I had chosen not to reveal myself sooner. Because the truth was simply that I did not want the version of you who knew what I was. I wanted the version who had already chosen kindness before she had any reason to expect a reward for it." Eleanor considered this in silence for a long moment, the cold night air settling around them both, the distant strains of the orchestra drifting fainter now as the hour grew late. "I think," she said finally, "that I have spent so long believing myself unremarkable that I hardly know what to do with being called a revelation. Then I shall simply have to spend the rest of our lives together reminding you," he said, "until you believe it as thoroughly as I do." "Good," he said. "Because I intend to marry you, Eleanor Hartley, and I would very much prefer to do it without a great deal of apologizing for my choice." It was not, perhaps, the most conventionally romantic proposal ever spoken beneath a moonlit terrace, but it was entirely, unmistakably honest, in exactly the way she had come to trust from him, and honesty, she had learned over 3 cold nights in a dairy house, was worth infinitely more to her than practiced elegance. "You are certain," she said, not from doubt of his feeling, but from a lifetime's habit of guarding against hope too easily given. "You are certain this is not merely gratitude, dressed up as something grander?" "I have been grateful to a great many people in my life," he said, taking both her hands now, his thumbs tracing gently over the small, work-worn calluses she had always been faintly ashamed of, and that he seemed, instead, to treasure. Gratitude does not keep a man awake for 3 nights turning over every word a woman said to him. Gratitude does not make a man ride out in a snowstorm, in defiance of every adviser who told him it was beneath his dignity to speak so publicly of a girl with no fortune. "I am not grateful to you, Eleanor. I am in love with you. I have been, I think, since the moment you looked at a freezing stranger and saw only a man who needed help, and gave him everything you had without once asking what it would cost you." There, on the terrace, with the last strains of the orchestra drifting out through the open doors, and the whole glittering, gossiping county still murmuring somewhere behind them, Eleanor Hartley, the plain daughter, the overlooked one, the girl who had made peace years ago with a future of quiet, unremarked usefulness, allowed herself, at last, to believe that she was loved, not despite everything she had resigned herself to being, but precisely because of it. In the weeks between the ball and the wedding, Eleanor discovered that being chosen publicly by a duke did not, as she had half expected, erase the old habits of a lifetime overnight. She still rose early from long practice, still found herself reaching to mend a torn hem before remembering she need not, still flinched faintly whenever her mother's voice sharpened, bracing for a criticism that no longer came quite so often now that the family's fortunes and its opinion of her had both been so thoroughly rearranged. Change, she learned, was not a single grand moment on a moonlit terrace, however much that moment had mattered. It was a slow unlearning, patiently allowed, of every small belief she had once held about her own worth. Alaric was, in this, unexpectedly patient. He did not simply declare her transformed and expect the years of quiet diminishment to vanish, because he wished them to. He noticed, instead, the particular moments when old habits surfaced, when she apologized for taking a seat near the fire, when she deferred automatically to Cassandra's opinion in matters of no real consequence, when she assumed. From long practice, that her own preferences mattered less than everyone else's, and he met each one not with impatience, but with a steady, unhurried insistence that her preferences, her comfort, her voice, mattered every bit as much as anyone's in the room. "You need not earn your place here," he told her once, gently. When she had spent an entire afternoon arranging flowers for a dinner she was not even required to attend, simply because it had not occurred to her that she might rest instead. "You are not required to be useful to be welcome. Eleanor, I chose you. That is not a debt you owe repayment for." It took her longer than she expected to believe him fully. But believe him, in time, she did. The wedding, when it came in early spring, was neither the grandest nor the most fashionable the county had ever seen, but it was, by every account that mattered, the warmest. Cassandra stood beside her sister, as her attendant, radiant and, for the first time in either of their lives, entirely without envy in her expression. Even Mrs. Hartley, who had spent months alternating between disbelief and increasingly elaborate attempts to claim credit for the match, found herself, on the day itself, unexpectedly moved to tears at the sight of her overlooked daughter walking toward a future no one, least of all Eleanor herself, had ever thought to imagine for her. Mr. Hartley, for his part, wept openly through the entire ceremony, and confessed afterward, with the particular clumsy honesty of a man unused to expressing feeling directly, that he had spent years quietly ashamed of how little he had done to protect Eleanor from her mother's favoritism, and that watching her claim, finally, the happiness she had never once demanded for herself was the proudest moment of his life. Alaric had kept, in the years that followed, the same wool blanket Eleanor had once wrapped around a dying stranger at her family's gate, folded now and placed somewhere it could always be seen, not out of sentimentality alone, though there was plenty of that, but as a private reminder of the truth he had learned in that storm, that the measure of a person is never found in how they treat those who can reward them, but in how freely they give to those who, by every practical calculation, owe them nothing at all. Eleanor Hartley, who had spent 23 years believing herself destined for a life no one would ever fully notice, became instead a duchess whose quiet strength, steady kindness, and refusal to perform for anyone's approval was in time spoken of throughout the county not as an oddity to be whispered over, but as the very quality that had made her worthy of the love she had once believed was never meant for girls like her. And on cold winter nights, long after the story of the stranger at the gate had become a favorite told and retold in drawing rooms across the county, Eleanor would sometimes stand at the window of Ravensmere Hall, watching the snow fall over grounds she had once only imagined from a distance, and think that the truest kind of love was never the kind that announced itself with titles or fortunes or grand declarations at all. It was the kind that recognized, in a moment of complete and unguarded vulnerability, exactly who a person was, and chose them anyway, fully, without condition, for precisely the reasons the rest of the world had always overlooked. Years later, when their own daughter asked, as children so often do, how her parents had first come to love one another, it was never the ballroom Eleanor described first, nor the gowns, nor the astonished murmur of the county learning at last who the stranger in the dairy house had truly been. She spoke instead of the storm, and the cold, and a lantern carried out into the dark, against every sensible advice she had been given, of a single wool blanket, worn thin from years of use, offered without hesitation to a man whose name she did not know, and whose gratitude she had never once expected. "I did not give it to a duke," she would tell her daughter, drawing the girl close against the evening chill. "I gave it to a stranger who needed it. It was only afterward that I learned those were never two different men at all, only one man, finally seen for exactly who he was, by someone who had stopped expecting the world to notice her." And Alaric, listening from the doorway as he so often did during these quiet evening tellings, would think, as he always did, that he had searched half his life for someone who wanted nothing from his name, and had found her, at last, freezing at a stranger's gate, asking for nothing at all except the chance to help. It was, he had come to believe, the truest kind of love there was, the kind offered before it was ever asked for, to someone who had done nothing yet to earn it, simply because kindness, freely given, had never once needed a reason.